Hello, everybody. Welcome to Finding Ourselves, Riding Through the Queer Archive, live today from the beautiful Town Hall Theatre, Galway, as part of the Kirch International Festival of Literature. Kirch runs from the 21st to the 25th of April, and you can view back events you missed on our YouTube channel. My name is Mark Ward, and I'm a poet from Dublin, Ireland. I've written 2 chapbooks, Circumference and Carcass, and my first full-length collection, Nightlight, is forthcoming next year from Salmon Poetry. I'm also the founding editor of Impossible Archetype, an international journal of LGBTQ plus poetry. Next, I'd like to introduce our guests. To my right, Seán Hewitt is a poet, lecturer, and literary critic. His debut collection, Tongues of Fire, was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award. In 2019, he won an Eric Gregory Award. He's also the winner of the Resurgence Prize 2017. His memoir, All Down Darkness Wide, will be published in 2022. He is also the soon-to-be poet in residence for the Irish Queer Archive. To my left, Chandrika Narayanan-Mohan is a Dublin-based arts manager and writer from India. Her work has been published in Writing Home, The New Irish Poets, Hold Open the Door, Green Carnation's 25 Young LGBTQ plus Poets from Ireland, Banshee, and Poetry Ireland Review. Chandrika was the editor of Poetry Ireland's Trumpet Issue 9. To my right, Kit Fryatt is a writer and academic based in Dublin. He was born in Tehran in 1978 and lived in England, Singapore, and Turkey before moving to Ireland in 1999. Kit lectures in English at Dublin City University, and his most recent book of poetry is Body Servant. And finally, to my left, we have Llaura McGee. She is an artist, writer, and game maker from Donegal. She is best known for her 2014 narrative Curtain, which follows the destructive relationship between 2 women in a Glasgow punk band, as well as the 2020 visual novel If Found, which follows the story of a trans woman in 1993 returning home to Achill in the month before the end of the world. We're going to chat about being queer writers and artists in Ireland, building a contemporary queer canon, archiving our art and a living history for future generations, as well as, of course, focusing on our panel's wonderful work. But first, to set the scene, we're going to kick off with some readings. Seán, if you would read a bit from Tongues of Fire.
Sure. It's lovely to be here with people. We've just been talking about how strange that is. I'm just going to read one poem, but it's a long one. It's called Dryad. I remember her covered in snow, in a field where each dead stalk of wildflower was thick with frost. The sky was pink in the hawthorns. The day held on the light edge of breaking. A woman carved from the bole of an oak, her feet, if she had any, buried in the winter's shedding weight. Whoever had turned her from the tree had given her an orb, which she held in both hands, close to the gentle curve of her face. And she stood there by the half-rotten stile off Broad Lane, head bowed, as though waiting to greet us and offer the frozen circumference of a new world. Years ago, our school had planted the woods behind her when I was 8 or 9. And now each tree ages alongside us. Every time I go back, I see a part of my life laid out, still growing in a field by the old village. And I used to come here often, at 18 or so, with men at night. And it was strange to pass her. We stumbled in the undergrowth and into the woods, like deer plummeting through the wet branches. And I think now of all the men forced outside after clearing out into the dark spaces of towns, how they walk in vigil to woodlands and old estates, to the smell of the day settling. Once I came here with a man whose whole body was muscled, as though he too had been carved from a single trunk of wood. I pretended all the time to be a man like him, answering each lie in a deep, alien voice. I think I was afraid he would kill me, and walked a few steps ahead, hearing him moving through the sodden grass, pulling his feet from the bramble vines. We passed the woman without comment, though she stood there in her cloak of wood, the globe held in the lathed green of her hands. Here was so unlike the places other people went, a place without doors or walls or rooms. The black, heavy-leafed branches pulled back like a curtain, and inside a dark chamber of the wood, guarded and made safe. The bed was the bed of all the plants and trees, and we could share it. And then the kneeling down in front of him, keeping my secrets still in the folds of night, trying not to shake in the cold, and the damp floor seeping up. I remember the cold water spreading in the capillaries of my jeans. As I looked up, the sky hidden under a rain of leaves, each tree stood over me in perfect symmetry with his body. Each was like a man with his head bent, each watching and moving and making slow, labored sighs. And I came back often, year on year, kneeling and being knelt for in acts of secret worship. And now each woodland smells quietly of sex, not only when the air is thick with it, but in winter too, when the strains are grounded and held against the earth. And each time I half expect to meet someone among the trees or inside the empty skeleton of the rhododendron. And I wonder if I have ruined these places for myself, if I have brought each secret to them and weighed the trees with things I can no longer bear. But then I think, what is a tree or a plant, if not an act of kneeling to the earth, a way of bidding the water to move, of taking in the mouth the inner part of the world and coaxing it out. Not just the aching leaf buds in spring, the cloud of pollen, or in autumn the children knocking branches for the shower of seed, but the people who kneel in the woods at night, the woman waiting by the gate, offering to each visitor a small portion of the world in which they might work for the life of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Seán. That was beautiful. I think that's my favorite poem in Tongues of Fire. Chandrika, you're to read next.
Hello, and thank you for having me, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I will read one long-ish one and two short ones. So this is You City, You Boyfriend. Seated awkwardly on a wooden box, one of the last of my cigarettes, my fifth in 2 hours. He talks and talks and talks, and my replies are only punctuation for his next sentence. Across from a grey slab tower, the city smirks, raises an eyebrow as if to say, "You know I'm so much better than him." And you're right, because when we converse through the choke of soft air, we exhale each other in whispers on a walk home where a smile is broken my face from the realization that, yes, you are better than him. You are better than all of them because you push up through my thin soles and I feel every pebble when I'm treading across your tar bump skin and I feel embedded in you. You city, you boyfriend, you dusty hug. And when I tell you that you're beautiful, you blush across the canal, even though you already know that gray glamour suits you and you don't need to be told. I wear you like an arm across my shoulder. And when the wind pushes my hair back, I don't need an errant hand across a cafe table to push it aside. Like me, you play your cards close to your chest, but when we mourn, we crack with rain that pummels onto the pavements and across a million cheap umbrellas. So take me in and make me yours, because I've already let the pollen in my pores anoint me to an orchestra of rustling leaves and seagull song, and one day I will take thee to be my full wedded home, and I shall wear a dress of summer fog and a ring of past lives, and you will smile and shrug. And in your humid indifference, I will vow to love you anyway, because I'm a hopeless romantic, and you're a city that keeps its own name. The next two poems are about my mom, who's a very good muse. She actually gets me writing poetry. So this is called Ararat. My mother is a Bible. She inks her sadness into uniform lines that I reach for in the comfort of darkness to trace fingers along familiar choices. My mother is a prayer. She becomes the psalms I chew over dinner, the repetition in my fury, the snarl in my hair. My mother is risen. She holds aloft a tumor the size of a cathedral in gold mosaic, radiation like sunshine warm with blood. My mother is a prophecy. She screams across the desert, her tongue a testament, as she teeters above the memory of a deluge. And finally, one last one, stargazing with my mother. We've seen stars fall before, she says over the phone, as we peer out over rooftops from different sides of Europe, looking for a blip or a spark against the blue, trying not to mistake a rocket for a star. You need binoculars, she says. And I remember how she demonstrated before handing me a pair as the Hale-Bopp comet blazed across a New Delhi sky. Look, over there, she exclaimed one time, pointing to a needle streak of white as we stood outside a Swiss hotel, not caring what people would think of two Indian women gazing upwards into the night. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Chandrika. The first poem you see to your boyfriend is to give a post from Daedalus Press's Writing the New Irish Poets. And also, I should have mentioned that Tongues of Fire is out with Cape Poetry. Next, we're going to have Kiss reading poems.
These poems are byproducts of a project that chose the moment of a global pandemic to turn site-specific on me. They're about, I suppose, that time towards the end of the medieval period when there was a kind of a cultural trend in Europe for the millenarian, the morbid and the grotesque. And the first and the last ones were also sort of mishearings or mistranslations or something of Baudelaire's spleen poems. At any rate, I am like the king of an older country in which a novel like happiness must end in straight marriage, though no one in it is heterosexual. The clever fellow dandling a doll is destined for the heroine's schoolgirl lesbian rave, the statuesque mezzo-soprano for collapse. Everywhere is the grey flannel of legitimate concern that we could all do without, except the powerful seem impotent to curb it, and it loiters like the lower deck of a transi tomb beneath all that gay corruption. I wonder if it's still possible to believe in some sort of alchemy, making matter supple enough to tug my megalo-clitoral pinky into a creditable limb, if not a winsome marrow, and let blood spring, verdant and forgetful, quite blanched of any life beforehand, humiliation or spleen. Potcock, his summons. Contemporary legend tells of a devil called Potcock who appeared in Edinburgh to prophesy the catastrophic defeat of the Scots at Flodden in 1513. It must be the flag of my disposition, but I can't pass the mauve yogurt in its tubs serried in the supermarket dairy wall without singing its name. Fruits of the forest, to the grand old air which rends to show a youth against millefleur, his palfrey as creamy as his cartwheel hat, whose golden dyed edge matches the reins, his boat-necked costume cut so low and so tight that the hollow of his thigh is a spoonful of angel food, the colour of mallow, plucked before nightfall, scattered like a garland around a middle-sized, handsome man who spoke 8 languages, never cut his hair or beard, nor removed the iron circlet from his waist. Ekphrasis or something. This picture would be more for a man to have, bass notes of vetiver, leather, and the grave, in which over thorn roots a rook and a knave make their dim way to the mound where Olav the White held his hoggans, now the lav of a labyrinthine pub, a dim nave with a UV chapel in the south aisle. Brave it after a few jars and you want a sat-nav to get out of there. Or maybe, foxed and stained, it's an ascendancy hunting print, a litho by spy of a notorious castle jackeen, or a nude study mustachioed and restrained. But you know, in fact, the corn is waist high, the lens is topless, the lady, Vaseline. Brie, his dance. Germinal shoots its irritant wad of birch jizz into this year of respiratory hypervigilance. And in 1669, someone looked at the first known dance macabre scheme painted between the Assumption and Lady Day, 1424, old style at Saint-Innocent, Paris. God, I want a cat, though, glaring incredulously at me while I, do this and that and crapping in a tray. And said, this Parisian engineer, the Ironworks Road needs widened. Tear this crap down. I am 100 years farther in time from him than he was distant from the painters who, while the season turned from fruitful virgin to irritable urn-inverting verse, ran their own gamut from Pope to hermit, and all that time the dead behind the wall were declining gently into soap, as here the quick made a stroke, and there rubbed one out. Thanks very much, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Kit. Myself and Kit met many, many years ago. I had a queer poetry reading series at About House Dublin, and I've forgotten how well you read, and it's been a pleasure to hear that again. Laura, finally, is going to read from her visual novel, If Found.
Hi. So this is a short excerpt from the full piece. And I was the writer, but also, I want to give credit to my co-writer, Eve, and it was like a whole team effort because it's a piece of interactive fiction. So there's Leah Young's illustrations, which I will do my best to embody. So, I'm home for a month, then back to Dublin. I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. It feels like I haven't been on the island in years. Anything to keep myself busy and keep myself away. But it's nice, or it's something anyway, to be fed every day and to sleep in my own bed. Tea, hot water bottles, say your prayers, sleep tight. But I can't. The room feels unnaturally dark. There are no lights outside the window and no sound. I briefly wonder if I'm dead. Maybe that's always been the way. I want to say something to Mom. Not in person, of course, but maybe in a letter. Hi, Mom. This is who I am. Who I want to be. Here's my name. If you don't mind too much, Ta. But I don't want to make a fuss. Old room, old habits. Old bones. Can't we just move on? I get up to think and to figure out how I will talk to her. A plan of some sort. Mommy loves you. She loves you. I sit at the kitchen table at 12:30 at night, and I sit and I sit. My wee pet, what are you doing awake at this hour? There she is herself in the door. Hi, Ma. Just wanted to make a cup of tea. The pot's warm. Lovely. I'll join you then. And what do you have there? I close over my notebook. Nothing. Oh, I thought you might be drawn. You used to do such lovely drawings when you were small. Are we artist? Maybe I should have gone to art school. You had so much potential. You could have done anything you put your mind to. Did you know Luke got a very good job in Castle Bar, working for the bank? Well done, Luke. He said they're always looking for people, that it's very technical, lots of numbers. Could be good for you. Ah, Mom, not now, not again. Don't tell anyone, but Maureen said he's making near 35 grand a year. You know, you can't turn that down easy. Mom, I'm going back to college after Christmas, start the PhD. Well, will you ever finish all that? And what will that get you? What will you do then? Will you make any money? You know, you can't keep scraping by, pet, and we can't help that much. It's what I'm excited about. Stars and things, right? Yes, the cosmos, the universe. I want to study the Big Bang, how everything got started. Well, all right. But are you ever thinking how you're going to look after yourself? Not to mention, of course, looking after a family of your own. I don't say anything. Look, pet, I just don't understand the whole alternative thing. You know, there was a great show about teenagers and their phases on Liveline the other day. And it's not a phase, and I'm hardly a teenager anymore. Well, you're going to have to come down to earth sometime, settle down with a nice woman and get your life together. And once you have children of your own, you'll understand. I don't want the same life as you and Da. Don't mention him. He wouldn't have entertained this cheek for a second. We always just wanted the best for you and your brother. Then let me try and live the life I want to. How can this be the life you want? That hair, those clothes, you look some state. It's none of your business. Oh God, you're lost. I don't know who you are anymore. You're not the son I've known. And what gives you the knowledge to say who I am? Maybe the problem is I don't want to be your son. Don't you dare take that tone with me, ungrateful brat. Jesus Christ, I want to tell you something. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. I can't take any more of this. Come back here now. Come back this instant. Half an hour in the rain later, I make it to Column's door, soaked to the bone. I can hear in my head my mom saying, I look like a drowned rat. Column answers my knock. He looks at me once and without a word takes me inside. And off he goes to find a towel and a blanket, fit for a rat's night's sleep. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Laura. It's such an unforgettable scene it found in the big crux of the game itself. We're going to talk generally for about 20-25 minutes. We will be taking audience questions at the end as we are actually here live in the theatre. So get your questions ready. To start, I just want to throw out a general question to everybody. I want to ask about your experience of being a queer writer in Ireland today, how your work intersects with other queer writers, and if you think there's such a thing as a contemporary queer canon. Chandrika, if you'd like to start with that.
Do I?
Yeah, well, or anyone else. I mean, if anyone wants to jump in. What's your experience of being a queer writer in Ireland today?
I think I have a slightly different experience, I suppose, because in terms of, I guess, identity and writing identity, it is very much about migration before anything else. So I suppose I don't necessarily frame any of my writing around queerness per se, but at the other side of that, it's really great to see more writing by other queer writers and kind of realize community-wise that that's a community I suppose I'm part of. And I hadn't really thought of that because I'd always been focusing so much on the identity of you're the immigrant, you are visibly different from everyone here, you're not from Ireland. And that was at the forefront of my mind, I suppose, in terms of where I belong, in terms of writing communities and communities in Ireland in general. And I suppose now that I realize you don't have to write about queerness to be a queer writer, that's a whole revelation for me, I suppose. And I suddenly realized, oh, actually, no, absolutely loads of queer writers, and I hadn't really thought about it. And I think there's a comfort in it, in seeing how many people are out there, some of them, explicitly talking about queerness in their poetry and their writing and having that be sort of the thing they write about. But for me, actually, it's nice to relate to the ones that like actually don't, because that's kind of like me, that we belong in the community. But it's okay if we don't explicitly address that in our writing. But yeah, so for me, it's more about being part of a gentle community, that it's not super explicit in our creativity, but we still belong there, and it's nice.
Okay. And what about yourself, Sean? What do you think about kind of queer writing community in Ireland, or is it a community or a disparate thing? Or
I'm quite a solitary person anyway, so and I've only been in Ireland for 3 years now, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that.
all opinions are valid.
Yeah, I get the sense of a building wave at the moment from anthologies that are coming out, events like this, radio programs, reading series, Impossible Archetype. There seems to be a lot of outlet and interest that I can't say if it wasn't there before, because I wasn't here before, but it seems to me that there's energy. I think in terms of canons, it's a difficult question, because I think often all over the world, queer people can be faced with a sparse canon behind us, in explicit terms. Like there may well be many queer writers amongst those who are in the canon, but looking for ways of connecting to them through queer experience can be difficult. So in my own personal sense, I've tended to take as my models American poets and writers like Tom Gunn, and then back a bit to Hopkins, and I suppose all writers are kind of magpies. I don't feel the insistent need to have only queer models behind me, but I think it means a great deal to have them as well. Yeah.
And Kit, what would your take on this be? I suppose as well, like Sean and like Chandrika, you've come from elsewhere. Does that have an impact on your experience of the queer writing community, if such a thing exists?
Yeah, I was just thinking that I fairly recently wrote an essay about women's poetry in Ireland in the 70s and 80s, and I wanted to find some lesbian and bisexual and queer women's writing, and all I found was a quotation which said, "Well, I know some lesbian writers, but they're not out." So obviously things have come on enormously in the last sort of 30 years or so, but I think it's something that's I echo very much what Sean said, that it's something that's still building, but I think it's nice that we can we can pick our canon from elsewhere as well, that we can take our canon from wherever we find it, and I think that's we can find our communities beyond the shores of Ireland as well. I think it's something that metaphor of a wave. It is coming, and it is developing. And I'm very excited to sort of be a part of it.
And Laura, obviously, you're coming from this as a game maker, and you've a slightly different audience, but you've just as wide, if not a wider audience, I suppose. And what's your experience of...
I love being a weirdo among poets and a weirdo among game makers, being on the outside always. For me, this question, what it kind of like just made me realize was that I was coming into my queerness and accepting that at the same time as kind of I was coming into my writing. For a long time, this was something that, okay, I can't write. I gotta get a real job. I can't be trans, I can't be gay. This is not something that is acceptable. And like where that started first was like those first tentative steps. And as I kind of like started coming out and meeting, because so many queer people are so creative, it's not just writing, but it's like music and it's all these things, I met like Chandrika through spoken word. But what's also interesting is like at first, yeah, I was still afraid to talk about myself. Like even with Ifan, which is, you know, what we worked on for a number of years, up until, you know, halfway through writing it, it was set in a fictional kind of space. It was set in a nondescript time, and the themes were a lot lighter, and the main character wasn't trans. None of that was in there. It was kind of just more about the emotions. And then when I kind of gave myself the permission to be open and be, okay, Cassio is trans. We said it in 1993 because, you know, this was a time then Ireland was changing quite radically. It was just a year after homosexuality was like formally like declared like legal. Not that it wasn't happening, obviously. And having that like strength to like be open and make it about these explicit things, you know, like really enrich the work, but also, yeah, just let me be a bit more brave. You know, I was so scared putting it out there, like what would people think? So yeah, like the kind of the 7-year journey, I would say, between like me coming out and like coming out as trans in 2013, 2014 was a very different time than it is now. Not that it's better now necessarily, because there's so much like terrible stuff out there. But I think definitely we can be a lot more open. You know, we can be on this stage, which is great, and talk about queer writing, which is just really exciting. And for me, it's kind of queer writing as a whole, but also just all the different creative angles. I think that's kind of the thing about queerness, is that like you're not too worried about whether it's going to be a novel or it's going to be a chapbook. You know, like I think I had the most exposure to like zine culture and kind of that kind of makery, like small things. And yeah, the fact that like a video game creator is up here, you know, I think queerness means like doing the weird things at the edges that aren't necessarily like the heteronormative or the previously sanctioned. You know, it's kind of like making your own path.
And I absolutely, I think there is something inherent to shades of queerness, that there is that creativity there, even if you're not necessarily creating work yourself. Speaking of kind of looking at that, Seán, like one of the reasons this event has come about is because you have been appointed the poet in residence at the Irish Queer Archive. Before I ask you about that, I want everybody else here, I'm going to ask you a question. If you could be a writer in residence anywhere, where would it be? So have a think about that, and I'll come back to you, and perhaps we can speak it into existence. Seán, can you tell us about how the residency with the IQA came about, when it will start, what it would be?
Yeah, I think it actually came about via Twitter. Sasha, the festival director, I actually can't remember who was. I think Sasha had tweeted about it, and then I kind of, not very coyly, DM'd her and was like, you know, wouldn't it be great if there was something like a poet in residence there? And then anyway, she got the hint, and we kind of did this this dance around thinking about how that might work. And Sasha did a great job of connecting. I mean, literally all the groundwork. I have just been slotted in. Got in touch with the National Library of Ireland, partnered with them, applied for money. So all things going well, May, I'm going to be there for 3 months. Luckily, there are digitized collections as well, so I can start work online until I'm allowed on site.
There's a lot of stuff that's not catalogued yet, isn't
There's
it?
a lot
Not
of stuff
accessible.
that's not. I don't know how much is uncatalogued, but at least a lot of it is undigitized.
Yeah.
So there is a big photographic archive that is available online, and everyone can see that at home. And there's some really great photos in there. And then I've been kind enough. I've not been kind enough. People have been kind enough to offer their own kind of personal archives to me. So I've had people coming in, sending me links to Google Docs with correspondence in, people sent books to me. So it feels like there's a great energy towards the project itself. And I'm hoping I can do it justice. The plan is to write 10 poems by later in the autumn. So Fingers
I'm
crossed.
sure it'd be fascinating. I know, for example, like Tony Walsh would have been the curator of it and managed it for decades. Like I don't know if you haven't spoke to him, it's essential because he is he seems to be the historian of Ireland's queer cultural history all on his own almost. But yeah, it's going to be very exciting. And I look forward to those poems. Now, putting you all on the spot, where would you like to be writer in residence? What's your dream residency, Chandrika?
NASA.
That's
Boom.
a good answer.
Aiming for the stars, Mark.
That's
what
a
I'm
good
doing.
answer. That's a good answer. We have to make that happen. Laura, where would you like to be writer in residence?
I mean, I think like also like obviously like there's the Irish Queer Archive, which is incredible, but I should give a shout out to, I think Sarah Phillips has the Irish Trans Archive.
Yeah.
And like she's amazing and like does such great stuff. And I think if I was to do anything specifically, I would just like to do more workshops showing other people how to like make interactive kind of works and pieces. Sometime that'd be very cool.
Cool. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that like the IQA, I'm throwing my hat in for successor.
We're all queuing up.
Absolutely, we're all queuing up after you. Kit, what about yourself?
Well, I was talking there about a project that turned site specific on me. I've become very interested in wall paintings from the medieval period. Not very many of them survive in Ireland. There's some that survive on Clare Island, and I think I would like to go there. There's very few that are secular. Most of them are religious, and they're located in religious buildings in churches. But there is near where I grew up in Peterborough, which Peterborough's a bit of a kip, but it's got a great cathedral, and it's got a great medieval house called Longthorpe Tower, which has some secular medieval wall paintings, including one I believe of a farting dragon. And I've never actually been there, despite growing up very near it. I didn't find out about it until it wasn't possible to go there. So somewhere like that where there's some medieval paint on the walls.
Fabulous. That sounds fantastic. And I suppose, like you were talking about ekphrastus, I'm working on a series of poems as well. Kind of, I find the ekphrastic poems are responding to art that already exists. Great writing prompts and exercise, but also a great way to kind of dig into our queer history as well. So Seán, I suppose we should talk about Tongues of Fire. One of the things you had mentioned before, I'm not sure where you mentioned it, you kind of wanted it to not be like other debuts that necessarily is about one thing. I want to have multiple aspects to it. Can you talk about the nature of, not the nature, the process of putting the book together and the different aspects?
Yeah, I suppose I didn't want it to be, I think what I meant by whatever I said was that I didn't want it necessarily to be a themed book, as in a collection about X. And that's perhaps because it's a first collection, and sometimes, you know, you go through many different concerns as you go, but I wanted to have it to feel like a sort of organic whole. So there are aspects of more explicit queerness that might link in with the way that I think about the natural world in other poems where that isn't a part of it. So to have this kind of ecosystem of ideas knocking around the echo, and to try and do justice to a sense of multiplicity in the way that all of us, I suppose, approach the world. You know, we draw connections beyond any one theme. So that was important to me. And the book was published in 2020, but I think the earliest poem in there is probably about seven or 8 years old. So I wouldn't be expecting another book from me for a while. I'm very slow writer.
Okay.
A couple of poems a year is good going for me. So
okay. Well, I mean, I was going to ask that at the end, but we do have another book coming from you at some point. Next year we have a memoir coming, All Down Darkness Wide. Yeah.
I actually have found, I don't know if this is a common thing, but I find prose much more biddable than poetry. Poetry jumps on my back when I'm walking down the street and wrestles me to the floor, and I have to write the poem down. Whereas prose, I find that I can sit down and at least get out some sentences or at least get a paragraph. So the book came together a lot quicker. I started it in 2018, and it will be finished in August this year and out in the summer of next year. Memoir is a relatively anxiety-inducing thing to write. I wouldn't recommend it if you're prone to worrying. Mainly because I think in a poem, you have the opportunity to leave the poem. You can finish a poem wherever you want. You can start it wherever you want. And you can, through various techniques, hide yourself or hide what you're talking about even. Whereas in a memoir or in a novel, you need causality, you need explanation, you need description.
There's nowhere to hide, really.
No, you can't. The camera follows you wherever you go, and the reader wants to know where you're going. So it's a much more revealing process than the poetry. But I have, I have hidden myself in various ways that you will discover. There are some sort of not real aspects of the memoir too. There may be ghosts.
So next, moving forward, we'll be back to distorting yourself into the lyric eye once again.
Yes. Yeah.
You had mentioned nature previously, and I think it's very much. I think kind of nature in poetry is very much having its own moment. I think eco poetry, but I also think queer writing about nature is definitely having its own moment as well. I don't know if you've read Luke Turner's Out of the Woods, but that kind of, your book and his book very much are kind of at this zeitgeist of new writing about nature. Where did that come from? And it seems to be almost the main thing that binds together the whole book, I would say.
Yeah, I suppose perhaps it comes from a sort of queer perspective, in that perhaps in the back of my head I have a sense of that old sense of the woodland as or the forest as being a place where rules don't apply, where there's sort of wildness, where the repressed occurs, and those spaces as a sort of field of play for all of the things that don't exist within the town or the city. But that said, I've always lived in towns and cities, so usually, although I think if you read Tongues of Fire, you'd be forgiven for thinking it is set in wild places. The places are often, scraps of parkland in cities, or gardens, or all of those places. But I think
that's similar with Luke Turner's book as well. He's living in London, and it's very much about parks in London. And
but I mean, that's a part of queer history, is that we often go to places where we aren't watched in order to meet.
And places where you can see other people coming from a distance.
Yeah.
I was reading a good memoir about a trans woman recently, and they'd be at the top of a hill so they could catch in on before they arrived.
Yeah, I mean, places like Hampstead Heath, very much like that as well.
Yeah.
To continue, I feel I'd be remiss not to ask you about the Buile Sivna in Tongues of Fire, your versions of those. What prompted these versions, and are they is intended to be a work in progress? Will there be more of those, or are these just a section of them?
There are more, but there will not be more published.
Okay.
I did write a lot of them, and then I kind of cut them down. They are being published again in September, October by a publisher called Fine Press Poetry, with wood engravings by Amy Jeffs, who's made these gorgeous wood engravings of scenes of the book. Those were prompted really by a sort of writer's block, perhaps in the way that you were talking there about ekphrasis. I found it really useful to speak through a different story that was already set up for me. So some of it is translation, some of it is invention. And yeah, it's sort of, there's a chain in the book too, that takes on various sites of Irish poetry and attempts to queer them. So I think the Builishivna poems were my route into thinking that way. And then there are some more explicit ways of doing that in the book too.
Okay, thank you for that. I think I'll move on to Chandrika now. So Chandrika, I've been reading and following your work for quite some time. We met at a book launch, I believe. That was the first time we met in person.
Probably.
Yeah.
Was it the Writing Home book launch? I feel like
No,
that's
no,
where
no.
I met
I think
most
it was the
people I
One
know.
City One Book.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
The
We had a great
libraries.
crack at that.
That was always great.
What fascinates me about your work is how broad it is. You write poetry, you write short stories, you write nonfiction. It feels like you have this real uncontained desire for it, which I mean is a big compliment. When you're writing, what prompts a form for you? Like what makes something a poem or a short story?
I really like, Sean, how you described how poems attack you, because that's exactly, I was like, oh my God, it's not just me. That takes ages to like, make a body of poetry, because it really is, they just turn up, and I have to run and write them down because they'll be gone in 5 minutes and then I'll never get it back. So I suppose with poems, they just jump out of nowhere and that just happens. And I'm very lucky that they seem to turn out pretty great most of the time. And for me, the struggle is actually, how do I put structure on that and actually create more? And I find it really difficult. And I'm trying to find all these ways to like write in the morning and all that. Doesn't work. They need to come out. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Let's just leave them to live their life.
I fully agree with you. I think like there is an element of like, poems do attack you. Like you can sit there and go, okay, I'm going to write a thing, but the amount of times I'm like walking somewhere and I go, oh, I have to go and write this down.
And then like, I suppose with essays, actually, it's kind of similar with all of them, because there's usually just something has happened in life. And actually what's been interesting is a year without attending arts events has really affected my writing, because I'll go to lots of theater or like more book launches or something, and like something that someone else says and their work will spark off something. Like, and like a year without any of that bouncing ideas or sparking ideas off of other people has been really hard. And actually, what was it? I started watching masterclass videos, and I didn't want to watch anything about art. And I actually ended up being more imaginative about writing, watching Chris Hadfield's, hence the NASA residency I won.
They come from very strange places, I think.
But like, just hearing someone talk about something inspirational, talk about their lives, like it's just something that's been missing. But that usually triggers a line of like a path of thinking that I'll end up writing about.
Perhaps somebody will now come away from this and start writing directly afterwards. Your work has appeared in a number of anthologies, the Green Carnation Anthology of LGBTQ Writers, the Anthology of New Irish Poets, Hold Up in the Door, and of course your works in Editor. How do you feel all these intersections sit in your work? We were talking on the train about kind of all the different multiplicities and everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I do think a year of lockdown, which happens to also be the year I submitted a lot more, because I just decided that's what I'm going to do. I could see the overlaps a bit easily. And a lot of it's because the writing I did in lockdown that actually got published, mostly the essays, a lot of that was about isolation and confusion and confrontation, because a lot of it was just things I'd never thought about before, or like wanted to write about my life, or like, security with cultural identity, all those things. So I don't know, I suppose that the thing that they all have in common is a place of self-confrontation. And in the space where external sparks and triggers are missing, that's kind of where I've been forced to look inwards, and that's led to a lot of the essays. But in terms of short stories and stuff, a lot of that is influenced externally, because it's fairy tales or fantasy writing, and works about, people trapped in houses, which I was working on before the pandemic, which is, I have not been writing those. I thought I'd bench those for a while. But yeah, they all come from a place of, I guess, confrontation, confusion, and a bit of isolation.
Yeah. And then also you have your work as an editor. You edited Trumpet as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was great. So that's Trumpet is Poetry Ireland's literary pamphlet, and they had a sort of call out. Well, they had I applied to be editor, and luckily I got in. And yeah, it was interesting because I knew what I wanted to bring to it was, one, a multidisciplinary approach, which is why I got awesome Laura to write an amazing, amazing essay in it about games writing, but ended up as this amazing piece about identity. And I wanted it to be as representative as possible, which is really hard within 36 pages without being tokenistic.
Yeah.
But yeah, I knew I wanted a traveler writer. I knew I wanted to write about parenthood. I knew I wanted to write about things that aren't literary, typically literary, I suppose. And it was really great experience. And it's my first time editing. And yeah, I'm glad it's alive and out there and birthed into the world. Off it goes.
That's fantastic. I suppose as well, I kind of wanted to ask you about, I think there's a lot of women writers at the moment, and they're very much coming for, and what's your experience kind of?
Excellent. And there's so much of it in the last, I only moved here sort of 9 years ago, and I only really got into reading more contemporary Irish literature a few years ago because I worked at the liquor rooms and managed the book launch. I get all these books. And it's just been this deluge of amazing writing like Sinead Gleeson and Deirdre Sullivan. And it's just where people are allowed to talk about what they want to, like from the domestic to maybe even the mundane, but then also the spectacular and the scary and fantasy and everyday life. And it's a space that I feel is finally allowing everyone to say, we're just going to write about what we want to write about, and it's going to be great.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
I have a million questions, but I think we might be taking questions from the audience. Is that correct? Is that happening round about now? I'm not entirely sure if that's happening. I might continue on until that is happening. So, Kit, I might talk to you a bit about Body Servant. So can you tell us a bit about Body Servant?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a book that I sort of assembled out of things that I've been doing over, a little bit like Seán was saying, over quite a few years, and then it didn't have anything to sort of complete it, and then very kindly the good folk at Trinity, at Icarus, the Trinity College magazine, asked me to contribute a poem, and I did so. So I wrote a sort of a version of Blaise Cendrar's La Prose de Transsibérienne et La Paysanne de France, and it finished the book, and that was Body Servant there. So it was published in 2018 by Shearsman Books, a wonderful publisher of poetry. Tony Fraser, Shearsman is great.
It's a wonderful book, and it's really it really uses language in a very fresh way. It's really multiple and funny. It's really funny. Like it's really intriguing, all the reversals and the way that language is used and gender is changed and morphed and everything. It's a real towering achievement, I have to say. Are we taking questions from the audience?
Yes.
Yes, we are. Sorry. Okay. I was not sure. Sorry. Apologies. I could have asked questions for 100 million hours, and I still have more questions for Laura, so hopefully I'll get back to that.
The first question is from Helen. Some writers resist categorization, but last night Alex Chi, in conversation with Carmen Maria Machado, said that he's proud of and fought for his box as a Korean-American gay writer. How do you all feel about your boxes?
So, who wants to take that? Laura, how do you feel about your boxes? Do you feel like you're in a box?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I am. I think other people put boxes on me.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I did have one kind of, this is more a performance piece than fiction, where people crawled into a tent. That felt kind of like a box. Okay. And then the graphics were projected onto you. But the interesting thing about working with these kind of more artistic video games, or games which are like, is it literature, is it video games, is you have on one hand people say it's not literature, and the other hand people say it's not video games. So there's
definitely that debate with visual novels and
exactly,
and,
yeah, exactly.
What they disparagingly call walking simulators and stuff like that.
For me, like, I think I definitely, I'm like cool with my labels as like an individual, I guess. But when it comes to my work, it's I just do stuff, and like I'm less worried about what it is. Like honestly, I'm more excited when it's a weird and strange and in between things, and let other people try and like make up new words for it.
I think that's right. I think like visual novel doesn't do it found justice. Like the mechanics of the game, you're reading someone's diary and you're erasing their past and their diary entries, and it's a beautiful, stunning experience.
I think it's Kandinsky who wrote a really great and like one of his criticisms on art, where I think when you're trying to define like the borders of what is or isn't, it's always going to be pushed by the artist. It'll always, as soon as you put the borders down, they're out of date. And I think as queer writers, I think we're all like Chandrika's like mercurialism, like with all the different forms. I think that's the kind of the great thing about it.
Yeah. Anyone else got any boxes before we get another question? They feel trapped or happy in their boxes, perhaps? No.
I just kind of want to pick up something from Chandrika, what you said right near the start that I thought was really interesting for this question. In that I think, well, I am happy with my box. And I think what Chandrika, correct me if this is wrong, but it chimed with me in that I think you have to also be happy with what people perceive your box to mean, and what you're allowed to do within that box. So I think in an ideal world, I could be a gay poet, and that definition would not necessarily define the work that was produced or how it was received, and that you can have such a multiplicity within that identity that, yes, it's true, but also it doesn't necessarily mean one thing about what your work will be. And so the term gay poets wouldn't necessarily give us an insight into what the poetry was.
Yeah, it's not a pigeonholing that it may have been previously.
Yeah, and it felt like Chandrika really hit the nail on the head there with kind of this light bulb that you can be in your box, and that doesn't mean that you have to write from that box in a way, or it doesn't constrain the work that you do.
I think everyone has everyone has a million sections, and it occurred to me earlier, like the anthologies you'd been in an anthology of like queer poets and new Irish poets, and then you were in an anthology of mentors and mentees, so all the different intersections, all the different boxes. Yeah. Do we have another question from the audience there?
Yeah, this will be the last question.
Okay.
From James, for Kit and Laura, do you think your writings in historical/sci-fi fields are opposites, or do the genres have common ground that makes them both attractive to trans writers?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you think that your writings in historical/sci-fi fields are opposites, or do the genres have common ground that makes them both attractive to trans writers?
I think, like with any kind of creativity, there's like that creative leap anyway. And I think with my work, I guess it fine like plays with kind of magic realism and sci-fi. Like we are also pulling it from the real world. And I think that's when, it's the most interesting, when it's pulling from the real emotions and like the real feelings and like real time periods and everything. And I think, there's an interesting dichotomy. I wonder what Kit thinks about this, was when you're looking back on history at the same time, you are reinterpreting these people, like what does trans mean to someone from the 17th century? Like obviously there's always been people who played with gender and all these kind of things, but we're always seeing them through the lens of today, much like if we're looking to the future, we're seeing that through the lens of today. So in some way we're interrogating the present. But yeah, I'm really interested to see what you think about that.
No, I don't think, first of all, that science fiction and history are opposites at all. I think, science fiction often takes its inspirations from history, and its world building comes from history. So I think there's a great deal of overlap. It excited me to find people in history who are who can be described as trans, I think, who it excited me to find in history different conceptions of gender. You know, the belief in the early modern period, which is recorded in the essays of Montaigne, for example, that, you know, by jumping too hard, a woman could become a man. That, you know, basically the vagina would just invert and become a penis. And I thought, well, wow, that's really cool. You know, finding, you know, characters like Eleanor Rickener, who was around in the very late 14th century in London, and who had sex with lots of with lots of clerics, you know, lots of priests and monks. Because she found that I think they paid best, but was also sometimes known as John Rickener, and seems to have been a trans person of some kind. So no, I think that's incredibly exciting, and I think it opens up possibilities for us as trans people in modern times, you know, to see what the past was like.
Yeah, you always think that like how things are now is how it always was, or, you know, that it's new or whatever. But yeah, there's all kind of like cool trans and gendery and gay people throughout history, and much like looking to the future and being like excited about like possibilities, looking to the past and seeing people doing it in a corset or something in a suit, it's like, oh my god, you guys, you're killing it. It's exciting.
Speaking of that, what, like, my last question, I suppose, to wrap up and go back to the queer canon, what queer and trans and LGBTQ plus writing and art, I suppose I'd written happening now, but also from the past, what would you recommend if you could try out one thing to check out for our audience? What would it be? Start with yourself, Laura.
I mean, one of the first, I mean, it's interesting because there's lots of great Irish writers, but for me, it was when I first discovered trans women writers, and a lot of them were American. So there's Topside Press, and Casey Plett is a really great short story writer, and Imogen Binney, and they, you know, had like a whole zine culture as well. And then also at the same time, the queer kind of indie game space I'm in has a lot of queer and trans writers, which has been really inspiring. So if people are in any way inspired to check out what the hell is she talking about with video games, just search for Bitsy, which are these little small interactive things, and so many people making that stuff are queer, which is cool.
Fabulous. And Chandrika, what about yourself?
It's like, oh god, there's so many out there, even just like right now.
Just pick one.
Okay, I'll pick one, and I'd say Paulina Cosgrave's My Name Is my favorite poetry collection right now.
Yeah.
It's brilliant, and she's a queer writer, and the space within it is exactly what I love, where it's all the otherness together, but like love and violence kind of bubbles up through it, and there's some sci-fi thrown in, and it's just like it encompasses all these things I really love about literature and writing, and it doesn't have a queer framework over it. She just happens to be, and I think some of her work does address that, but like top of my head, it's like, yep, that's a poetry collection I'd recommend anyway. And I suppose that's how my brain works when I think about queer writers. It's that's kind of incidental. I'm like, well, I like that book. By the way, they happen to be queer.
I didn't know she was queer, and it's on my reading list, so I'm very excited.
I did ask her if she's out. I'm like, she's like, yeah, that's literally the poems are in there. I'm like, I'm so sorry, I didn't read it.
And Seán, what about yourself? What writing or art is inspiring you?
I forget everything that I've ever read when someone asks me that question, so I'm just going to go with what I'm currently reading, which is Detransition Baby, which is so funny. I stayed up late last night reading it, and I was reading it on the train, and it's smart, it's really sassy, it's kind of like Sex and the City but dirtier and more it's got such a kind of brutal, fun undertone to it, and also a big heart as well. I really, really would recommend it, and it's fun to read as well, I think, which I I have been missing fun,
Yeah.
and it's a very fun book.
I mean, it's emotionally tough. It's like you'll engorge it instantly, but then you're like
Yes.
torn apart.
Yeah.
It's on my list as well. And then Kit?
The last thing I really did before lockdown happened was go to the Derek Jarman retrospective in MoMA, and Derek Jarman has been a sort of love of my life from long before I knew I was queer, before I knew I was trans. He died on my 16th birthday, and I've always felt this sort of connection there, and it was through Jarman's work that I found myself multiple times. It took me a while to, it took me a while to, there were multiple findings, I suppose. So I gobbled up as many of the books that were there on sale in that retrospective, and the books that I already had of his, and that's something that sort of kept me going, is looking at that visual, that amazing visual sense, which I don't have at all. I'm kind of blind almost in every sense except to words, but to look at Jarman's work just sort of sets me on fire. It's amazing.
I got that. They had a catalogue. It's literally the size of my chest. It's called Protest, based on the exhibition. I got it for Christmas, and I highly recommend it. It is a fabulous coffee table book to scandalize your friends and neighbors with. All that remains, because I've babbled on for long enough, is to say thank you to Kit, Laura, Chandrika, and Seán for taking part in this wonderful event. I had much more questions for all of you, and I'm apologies I didn't get to ask you more. Thanks to Sasha and Ola, Kirch, and Emily, and everybody for putting it together. If you liked what you heard, we'd encourage you to buy our participants' books from Charlie Burns, which is Kurt's festival bookseller, who have a special Kurt section on their website where you can stock up. The festival is running until 25th of April, and please check out our other events at www.kirch.ie, as well as events from earlier this week at the Kirch YouTube channel. And finally, if you enjoyed this event, please consider donating to www.kirch.ie/support us to make sure more events like this can happen. I've been Mark Ward, and thank you again for attending Finding Ourselves. Bye, everybody.